For our gathering song, we'll sing number 389 in the Gray Hymnal.
So I have to tell you something funny about this sermon. So I taught UU 101 this weekend, which is our beginners class. I taught it Friday night and Saturday morning, and frankly, I've been super swamped since I got back from El Salvador. And I apologize to all those folks whose emails have not been returned. I'm really sorry, I really am. So basically what that means is that I sat down yesterday afternoon in a total last-minute headlong rush to write this sermon, and I got up at 5 a.m. to finish it, and the sermon is about the virtues of the Sabbath. I'm not asking for sympathy. I truly love my job, but as my friend from New York likes to say, how ironical. But let me ask the folks here, have you ever almost run a red light trying to get to yoga class on time so you can relax? People are owning it. That's how relaxation works in 2020. And it makes the idea of Sabbath so very appealing. The traditional Sabbath of Judaism, they call it the Shabbat, begins a few minutes before sunset on Friday night, and it ends when 3 stars appear in the sky on Saturday night. How lovely. And candles are lit in between those two events. Meals are eaten with prayers and blessings and songs. And work is explicitly forbidden. Now, the definition of work varies within different Jewish traditions, but it might include cooking or turning off or on electronic devices or using cars. I worked with a colleague in Boston who told me that she grew up next door to a man in South Boston who observed Shabbat very strictly, and he paid her as a child to light his cigarettes for him, since he was not allowed. However, I guess in his traditions, the act of smoking a cig was not considered work. So whether one follows the formality of Shabbat or not, Sabbath is an intentional period of stepping back from the demands of the rest of the week, a time for rest, for reconnection, maybe for delighting in simpler things. It's not simply turning off and retreating from the world in an act of agoraphobia. I think of Sabbath as a kind of active recovery. Now, active recovery is this idea from the world of sports fitness, and the idea is that after a person does a really intense workout or an athletic event like running a marathon or playing a whole rugby match or something, instead of just resting by not doing anything at all the next day, the athlete does some low-intensity exercise and movement. And in physical terms, that promotes blood flow to the joints and the muscles. It helps get the lactic acid out of the muscles. It's good for preventing injury. So when I think about Sabbath as a kind of active recovery, I think about it as an intentional act. I'm not just spacing out on the couch, although I'm fond of that too. I'm resting for sure, but I'm also trying to cultivate some self-awareness. When I'm not focused on working, in the absence of work thinking, work mind, what steps forward once that gets cleared away? A Sabbath asks us to stop and look at what we're doing. We create space for those feelings that have been pushed aside in the course of the work week. And when those feelings come, they might be comfortable or uncomfortable, but either way, we can be present with them in a way that's not available when we're rushing through our workday. And what that does, just like active recovery, it broadens our options for how we respond to things. So this November, I had the incredible luxury of spending 6 days in Belize at a yoga retreat. And we were staying at this fancy resort up by the rainforest, but our actual lodging was a camp about a quarter-mile hike from where the swanky lodge was and the casitas where people were paying $500 a night. We yogis were staying in these very basic wooden huts that just had screens and canvas roofs. There was no electricity, no cell signal, definitely no Wi-Fi, and we used kerosene lamps at night. So every evening after dinner, I'd read a book using my headlamp, listening to the rain on the canvas roof and the sounds of the rainforest that was just 12 feet away. Things got real simple. And I was surprised to find that after a couple of days of this, I felt more like myself than I had in quite a while. I had time to reflect, and I thought about my shot from the cannon past year that included serving my first congregation ever in Salt Lake City, and the whirling process of searching for a new congregation, and my transition to this fabulous congregation, all those things. And I realized in a deep way that I was exhausted. But because I was in the sabbatical space, the Sabbath space, I didn't feel resentment or depression. I just saw the truth of my weariness, and I could simply sit with it. And I recovered a lot. And Sabbath lets us find new options for how we respond to things. So my real delight about taking a Sabbath is that it is an act of resistance against the culture based on capitalism. So we're all stuck in this market system that's so pervasive that we frame everything in our lives as commerce, whether or not commerce is really going on. So in this UU 101 class that met this weekend, we had these fascinating discussions about how Unitarian Universalism in general, and Universalism specifically, is not a religion based on transactions, on a sale. What I mean by that is that, unlike some other religions, we don't make a bargain with God that if we believe in God and follow whatever rules God makes, we'll get salvation and eternal life. That kind of thinking, that's a deal, a transaction, like buying a used car or a pair of shoes. Our faith for God's reward, that's not Unitarian Universalism. And this extends to our personal relationships. So anyone who's been on an online dating site recently has surely noticed how it feels like a job application process, and how our personalities and appearances get commodified into products that appeal or don't appeal to the market. In our daily lives, capitalism makes us feel like our only worth comes from our productivity. Capitalism does not believe in inherent worth and dignity. Capitalism tells us we are only worthy when we are working and when we are consuming. And even if our work is for the common good, it's still work. Our busyness gives us our value in capitalism, even as we know that sometimes it consumes us and takes us away from our true selves. There's a great quote by the 20th century mystic and monk Thomas Merton, and I'd like to share that with you. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is to succumb to violence. More than that is cooperation in violence. The frenzy of the activist destroys their own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of their own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom that makes work fruitful. It destroys their own inner capacity for peace. End of quote. Reverend Anna Levy-Lyons is a Unitarian Universalist minister serving our congregation in Brooklyn, New York. And she wrote this great book called No Other Gods. And this book just came out, and in that book, she revisits the Ten Commandments as guidance for progressives right now. Now, the Ten Commandments have been used and abused, like so many parts of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament. But when she turns her attention to the fourth commandment, to the commandment about Sabbath, it's really good. That commandment requests that people observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So LaVallee Lyons calls capitalism the lethal addiction of our time. And she describes the cycle of pursuing intoxicating pleasures of new clothes, God, I love new clothes, of fruits from tropical places in midwinter, of binge-watching fluff. And with that comes the unrelenting cycle of wanting more, of getting more, and working more to sustain our habit. If we're lucky enough to actually get a weekend, that just becomes prep and planning time for the next round of work and consumption. She argues that time is really the only currency of our lives. And this frenetic work consumption cycle, it places us in the weird position of embezzling our own lives, as LaVallee Lyons puts it. Think of that line, embezzling our own lives. Begs the question, who owns our lives? Do we give them away to someone else, to a corporation, or do we truly take possession of them? LaVallee Lyons describes the act of Sabbath as a threat to our way of life in the very best sense. It's a threat to a way of life that really isn't working for us on a soul level. We need Sabbath because we can get over busy and disconnected from ourselves, but we also need Sabbath because we all carry pain. I've been thinking about that pain a lot lately. Is anybody actually surprised by that? And I was thinking about my friend Ed, and that's not his real name. Ed is feeling a lot of pain lately. He's a physical therapist, and his business is going under. And at the same time, his marriage is ending, and he's struggling with a really difficult custody battle. And I've been trying to be a companion to Ed in this difficult journey, and I came to understand his pain in a profound way. The pain that Ed is feeling is no more and no less than the difference between the love that he wanted to bring into the world through his healing work and through his family, and the reality of what the world allows. In this gap between his aspiration and what actually happened lies his pain. And the more I thought about this, the more I understood this to be a common experience. We all carry some pain, all of us, right, siblings? And some of that pain is from ways that the world falls short of our aspiration. We seek to create families of love. We want our work to be noble and effective. For me, I'm constantly reminded of the difference between what I want to see my ministry accomplish and what I'm actually capable of. That's a source of pain. And there are other kinds of pain that Sabbath or the practice of rest can bring healing to. Tricia Hersey is an African-American artist and poet based in Atlanta, Georgia. And Hersey has created an organization that she calls the Nap Ministry. And she speaks the truth that Black Americans have never really had a place in capitalism other than being its engine. And that systemic racism that has locked generations of Black Americans out of wealth, the wealth that is promised by capitalism, has been combined with a burnout culture that glorifies sleep deprivation. And the result is the fact that Black folks are 5 times more likely than white people to sleep less than 6 hours a night. 5 times more likely to sleep less than 6 hours a night. I can't last on less than 6 hours a night. And we know that poor sleep is associated with a whole lot of health conditions like heart disease and diabetes. And Hersey explicitly sees naps as a kind of reparation for the treatment of Black folks. In her research for this project, she researched the experience of enslaved Africans, and she learned that most enslaved Africans on cotton plantations worked 20 hours a day. 20 hours a day. There was no kindness in that. And as she did her research, she began to dream of her enslaved ancestors. And she felt like she was connecting with them as she dreamed in a spiritual realm. And by doing that, she was resting for all the centuries that they couldn't. Along with their labor, those enslaved people had their dream space stolen from them. So Hersey created the NAP ministry as an act of remembrance. It's a metaphor, but it's a powerful one. So Hersey calls herself the NAP Bishop, I love that. And she organizes collective NAP experiences that bring people together to nap for 30 or 40 minutes at a time. And she sees resting as not just self-care, but soul care. Her work is emphatically anti-capitalist and anti-racist, reminding us that our worth is not tied to our productivity and that naps are not lazy. They are a source of productivity, and they're generative. They are a source of redemption and wholeness where history has stolen those things. Sabbath has many purposes. So, I gotta admit though, I have some problems with some of the ideas about Sabbath though. And I really don't want this sermon about taking time and saying no to obligations and creating space. I don't want this to land on folks who are busy as some kind of Sabbath shaming. No Sabbath shaming. So, genuinely not having enough time to take a Sabbath of any form, that is not a character flaw. Let's be real about the lives of working families in particular right now. If we were to intentionally design a country that would be hostile to families, it would look a lot like the one we have right now. So to say to that poor overworked parent that's trying to keep it together with their family that they should not do anything at all on Saturday all day, that's just an unfair expectation. And it reminds me of something that seems to happen to people of conscience a lot, folks who are really trying to do the right thing. So a person looks around at this broken world and takes in the message that somehow it is solely their responsibility to fix it. So the country is too dependent on fossil fuels. I should feel shame for driving a car. The United States spends half its treasure on the military. I'm complicit for paying taxes. That's a trap. Feeling like we have to observe the Sabbath in order to stop capitalism, that's a convenient way for the powers to be to make individuals feel responsible for what is actually an exploitive system. A system we didn't design, but that we are trapped in. The minimum wage, it's a cruel joke. Employers reward unhealthy work-life balance, and our healthcare is tied to our jobs. Who can blame folks for working a lot? I also think that a traditional Sabbath isn't for everyone. There seems to be this unspoken expectation about Sabbath that says it's time to be spent with family, which can be a beautiful thing, but what about folks who don't have a family? Or families that have been ruptured? Or families that are so toxic that being away from them is a kind of self-care? Should we ask these folks to sit in their living rooms with the TV off? And there's also this interesting sort of unspoken contempt for personal activities that aren't slow or low tech. And I have a friend, a very successful and accomplished adult, who gets a lot of joy out of going to the video game arcade. Now, conventional practitioners of Sabbath would be aghast, but who's to say that playing air hockey is not a form of Sabbath? So let's get real. A full day off each week sounds lovely, but is it practical given the demands of everyday life? Seriously, everyone should get to spend a week in the rainforest in Belize, but is that realistic? I don't think so. So how do we make Sabbath practices that work for us? Well, one idea that I think is pretty reasonable is to take a social media Sabbath. So pick a day of the week, stay off Twitter and Facebook and all the other things. You can even change, or a person can even change their profile pic to say something like, I'm on a social media Sabbath, which will hold that person accountable, perhaps, and they'd get points for being really righteous too. But I've done that. I've done the social media Sabbaths on the regular, and it's a surprisingly powerful practice given the simplicity of it. Just got to remember not to pick up my phone. But I think really, the Sabbath that we each can do, the Sabbath that we choose for us individually, that's a deeply personal matter. Everyone can find a Sabbath that suits their possibilities and suits their purposes, even if it's just one mindful breath. Reverend Angela and I were talking the other day about managing our workloads, and she shared some advice that she received from her mentor when she was a young minister. Her mentor told her that as she was building her schedule for the week, she should consider what tasks cost her and what tasks feed her. What costs her, what feeds her. And with that in mind, she should try to create a schedule that maintains a balance. Now, no one always gets the luxury of making those choices all the time, but we can usually find some kinds of structures for Sabbath that we can hold without making more work for ourselves. I still really do believe in Sabbath, and at its best, Sabbath is a moment of grace that we offer ourselves without conditions. Just like our universalist tradition of salvation without strings, a real Sabbath gives us rest without asking if we deserve it. May we all experience that rest and renewal in a way that works for us. Amen, and blessed be.